At 0340 hours, on December 14, 1944, Technical Sergeant Ray Harmon pressed his back against a bamboo wall in a holding pen on the island of Leyte and listened to the sound of his own blood dripping onto the dirt floor. He was 31 years old, a farm boy from Harlan County, Kentucky. 12 years in the United States Army, 3 combat deployments, 47 confirmed kills before that night. The Japanese garrison outside numbered 59 men, armed, alert, and organized. He had a combat knife, a length of wire, and a problem with his left ear. The ear was gone. What was left was a wound that needed not to distract him. He did not let it distract him. He had 44 minutes before the next guard rotation. He used all of them. To understand what happened inside that bamboo enclosure in the hills above Ormoc Bay, you have to understand the broader catastrophe unfolding around it. The Philippines campaign was, by late 1944, a grinding, brutal thing. General Douglas MacArthur had returned to Leyte on October 20th, wading ashore in that famous theatrical gesture, and what followed was 6 weeks of some of the most savage fighting American soldiers had yet encountered in the Pacific. The Japanese did not intend to lose the Philippines. They could not afford to. Lose the Philippines, and they lost their oil supply lines from the Dutch East Indies. Lose the oil, and every warship, every aircraft, every mechanized division ground to a stop within months. So they sent everything they had. General Tomoyuki Yamashita committed nearly 350,000 soldiers to the island chain's defense. The terrain worked in his favor. Leyte was mountainous, jungled, and cut through with rivers and ravines that turned supply lines into nightmares, and gave skilled defenders an almost infinite number of places to disappear. American infantry pushed inland from the beaches and found that every ridgeline became its own small war. Ray Harmon had been in the Leyte fighting since the first week. He was attached to the 7th Infantry Division, a reconnaissance specialist tasked with pushing ahead of main elements to map Japanese defensive positions, count troop strengths, identify communication nodes. It was work he had learned in North Africa and refined in the Philippines during the early months of the war. Before Bataan, before the long years of island hopping that brought American forces back to where it had all started, he was quiet, methodical, and the kind of soldier who read the ground like a farmer reads weather. His commanding officer, Major Eugene Pressler, once said that Harmon could move through jungle so softly that birds did not flush from branches when he passed. On December 13th, that particular gift had failed him. He had been 30 hours into a solo reconnaissance sweep, threading through a section of forested highlands 8 miles northwest of the nearest friendly position. His objective was a suspected supply depot. Japanese logistics had been repeatedly disrupting American artillery resupply, and intelligence suggested a hidden warehouse complex somewhere in the hills above the Ormoc Valley. He found it. He also found the infantry company guarding it. 59 men from the 26th Infantry Division, dug in and disciplined and not where anyone expected them to be. He walked into their perimeter at 17:15 hours, stepping out of a tree line onto a cleared path that intersected directly with a 2-man patrol. There was a moment, perhaps 2 seconds, where all 3 men registered the situation at the same time. Harmon's Thompson submachine gun was slung. The Japanese soldiers' rifles were at the carry. Everyone evaluated. Then the Japanese soldier on the right moved first, and the decision was made for all of them. He fought. He was outnumbered within 30 seconds, as the noise brought 4 more soldiers at a run from the tree line. They took him alive because it was useful to take American soldiers alive. Intelligence, information, the locations of friendly units, the timing of planned offensives, the names and strengths of adjacent commanders. The Japanese Army of 1944 understood that a man in enough pain will provide all of these things eventually. They were not wrong about that general principle. They were wrong about Ray Harmon specifically. The garrison was housed in a cluster of structures built around the supply depot. 3 large bamboo warehouses stocked with ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Several smaller quarters buildings. A communications shed with a field radio. A single holding pen, roughly 8 feet by 12 feet, constructed of dense bamboo lashed with wire, set 30 meters from the nearest warehouse on the eastern edge of the compound. They put him in the pen at 1900 hours and spent 4 hours working on him. The officer in charge of the interrogation was a captain whose name Harmon later recalled only phonetically as something that sounded to his ear like Maury. The captain was educated, spoke functional English, and was not personally cruel in any theatrical way. He was simply professional about extracting information, which in practice meant the same outcome through less emotional means. What happened to Harmon's ear was a technique. It was meant to communicate that the process would continue and escalate until something useful was produced. Harmon produced nothing useful. By 2,300 hours, Captain Maury apparently decided the night's session was complete. He left instructions with the duty guards and returned to his quarters. The guards, 2 men rotating on a roughly 90-minute cycle, settled into their positions. The rest of the garrison, 56 other soldiers, ate dinner, cleaned weapons, slept in shifts. Inside the pen, Gemma Harmon spent 40 minutes in the dark doing 2 things. First, he stabilized himself. He had a serious wound, blood loss, and the psychological weight of several hours of methodical torture. He addressed the blood loss by pressing dirt against the wound until clotting slowed the drainage. He addressed the psychological weight by doing arithmetic. 59 men, 2 on immediate guard duty, the rest distributed across 6 structures. Guard rotation every 90 minutes, which meant he had observed 2 rotations and could predict the third. The next rotation was at 03:25. His window was between the current guards reaching maximum fatigue, around 03:40, and the 04:15 hours when dawnlight would begin to gray the eastern sky. Second, he inventoried what he had. His Thompson was gone. His .45 pistol was gone. His field knife was gone. He had his boots, his uniform, his belt, and the contents of his pockets that a rapid search had missed. A length of piano wire he carried coiled flat in the breast pocket of his jacket. Standard issue for reconnaissance men who sometimes needed to cut through fencing, and a small compass that had slipped into the lining of his right trouser leg through a worn seam months earlier and simply lived there. The wire was enough. At 03:38 hours, he worked a section of the pen's floor, lashing loose using the compass's metal housing as a lever. The bamboo poles were set into the ground, but not deeply, a few inches at most. He created a gap wide enough to slide through, low on the eastern face, where the shadow of the adjacent storage building provided cover. He was through in 4 minutes. He lay flat for 60 seconds. Nothing changed in the compound. The 2 guards at the pen's entrance were 20 meters away and watching the opposite direction. The nearest structure was the communications shed, 12 meters to his right. He moved to it first. What followed across the next 44 minutes has been reconstructed from Harmon's own after-action account, a document he dictated to a military stenographer in January 1945 while recovering at a field hospital near Dulag. The document is dry, precise, and reads like a man describing the repair of farm equipment. Sequential, technical, without ornamentation. He noted distances. He noted time. He noted which structures he cleared, in which order, and the means used in each case. The Army classified the account within weeks of its creation, as citing operational sensitivity around reconnaissance techniques. It was partially declassified in 1979 and sits today in Record Group 407 at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. The account makes no mention of what he felt during those 44 minutes. That was not information Harmon considered relevant to the report. He reached the communications shed and was through the door in under a minute. 1 man inside, asleep at the radio desk. Harmon used the wire. He then used the radio equipment to his advantage. Not to transmit, he had no codes and no meaningful contact information at hand, but to destroy it. A radio pried apart and its critical components removed as a radio that cannot call for reinforcement. He took 12 minutes on the radio. He came out of the shed with a Japanese Arisaka Type 99 rifle he had found propped against the interior wall and a canvas bag of loose ammunition. 30 rounds. He used those 30 rounds with significant economy across the next 32 minutes. The order of clearing mattered. He was one man with a single bolt-action rifle and a wire garrote, working against a company of trained soldiers in a compound where a single alert could bring every remaining man to arms. The math demanded silence as long as silence was available, and precision when it wasn't. He worked the quarters buildings from smallest to largest, using the terrain shadows between structures to move between them. The first 3 buildings he cleared without a shot fired. The 4th building, the middle-sized quarters structure on the compound's northern face, produced a complication. A soldier who had been awake, doing what? Harmon's account does not speculate, came through a side door at the wrong moment and called out a challenge. Harmon fired once, a shot he described as clean at 4 meters, and immediately moved to the doorway before the sound had finished echoing off the tree line. He had 7 seconds before the men inside that building oriented to the noise and its source. He used 5 of them entering and 2 more working the bolt. 2 shots from the Arisaka inside that building. He was back outside in the shadows before any reaction reached the adjacent structures. The shot had been heard. He could tell from the change in the compound's rhythm. A door opening somewhere on the far side, a raised voice, the sound of boots on hardwood flooring. He had perhaps 90 seconds before a systematic check of the compound began. He stopped being silent and started being fast. The final sequence is the part of the account that military historians have returned to repeatedly in the decades since declassification. Not because of the violence of it. The Pacific War produced violence so extreme that a single man killing 59 soldiers in a 44-minute window, while remarkable, does not register as the war's most extreme episode. What makes the sequence notable is its structure. Harmon, operating alone, in the dark, injured, with a borrowed rifle and limited ammunition, executed what amounted to a textbook compound clearance. He triaged threats by location and response time. He used structure geometry to funnel reaction into kill zones of his choosing. He moved constantly, yet denying any individual soldier the time needed to acquire him as a stable target. The Arisaka ran empty with 11 men remaining on his count. He switched to the wire and a Japanese officer's katana he had taken from the 2nd building. He did not dwell on what either of those things required. He noted the tools in the account the way a carpenter notes which chisel he used on which mortise joint. At 04:22 hours, the compound was quiet. He did a systematic count. 59. He checked each one. 59. He then spent 8 minutes eating from the supply warehouse, treating his wound with materials from a Japanese medical kit, and loading a pack with provisions for the 8-mile walk back to friendly lines. He took the Arisaka, reloaded with ammunition from the supply building, and the compass from his pocket. He left everything else. He was 2 miles into the jungle by the time false dawn began to gray the sky. He reached the 7th Division's forward position at 11:30 hours on December 15th. Walking out of the tree line covered in dried blood, his own and otherwise, with a Japanese rifle on his shoulder and a pack full of canned food and maps he had taken from the communications shed. The maps turned out to be significant. They detailed Japanese supply routes and staging areas throughout the northwestern Leyte Highlands. Information that Division intelligence had been attempting to acquire for 3 weeks through aerial reconnaissance with incomplete results. The soldier who first encountered him at the perimeter wire was a 19-year-old private from Iowa named Dennis Holst, and Holst later wrote about the moment in a letter home that was preserved by his family. He described a man who walked as if nothing in particular had happened to him, who handed over the maps without comment, and who then asked, in a tone Holst described as unremarkable, whether there was anything available for breakfast. There was not. It was nearly noon. Major Pressler was notified within the hour. He drove up from the regimental command post and found Harmon in the aid station, having his wound cleaned. Pressler's account of their exchange is brief. He said, "I understand it was a bad night." Harmon replied, "I've had better." Then he asked about breakfast again. The debrief took 2 days. Military intelligence officers from multiple echelons wanted the maps examined and cross-referenced. Yet they wanted the garrison's location confirmed and an assessment of whether any communications had escaped the compound before Harmon destroyed the radio. They wanted his route through the highlands logged against known Japanese patrol patterns. They asked all of this of a man whose left ear had been removed without anesthesia approximately 60 hours earlier. He answered everything they asked. The maps he brought out proved immediately valuable. Within 72 hours, the 7th Division's artillery had targeted and destroyed 2 major supply depots, identified from the map's routing information. A third was raided by infantry 3 days after that. The disruption to Japanese logistics in the northwestern highlands measurably accelerated the American consolidation of Leyte's interior. And according to the after-action assessments filed by the division's operations officer, none of the assessments mentioned Harmon by name. He appeared in them only as recon element and attached specialist. The maps were noted as acquired through independent reconnaissance action. The 59 soldiers of the 26th Infantry Division's garrison appeared in no American assessment at all. They simply ceased to exist operationally. Their radio went silent, their position stopped reporting, and when a Japanese patrol eventually reached the compound on December 20th, 6 days later, they found what they found and filed a report that has never been publicly released. The question that inevitably arises when examining what Harmon did is the simplest one: how? Not how in the tactical sense. The after-action account addresses that in workmanlike detail. How in the human sense? How does a man who has spent 4 hours being tortured, who is losing blood from a serious wound to his head, who has no support and no certainty that any of what he is attempting will succeed, how does that man function at a level of tactical precision that professional soldiers who examine his account describe as, in the words of one Army Ranger instructor who lectured on the case in the early 1990s, a near-perfect compound clearance with improvised means? The people who study these questions, psychologists who work with special operations communities, researchers who examine extreme human performance under stress, point to a cluster of factors that tend to appear in cases of this kind. The prior training that has been internalized deeply enough to function without conscious management. A decision, made early and maintained deliberately, to compress the future into the immediate present. Not 44 minutes, not 8 miles of jungle, not a field hospital, but the next 10 feet and the next 30 seconds. And something harder to quantify, a fundamental refusal to accept the situation's implied verdict. Harmon had been told, in the most direct physical language available, that he was a man under the complete control of another force. That message had been delivered with conviction and at length. He did not internalize it. He listened to it carefully, assessed its tactical implications, and set about disproving it the moment an opportunity appeared. That is not bravery in the Hollywood sense, yet it is something more functional and more useful. It is the ability to treat a situation as a problem, and a problem as something that has a solution, even when the available solutions are all terrible. He found the least terrible one. Ray Harmon was born in 1913 in Harlan County, Kentucky, the third of 5 children in a coal mining family. His father worked the mines until black lung forced him out in 1926, and the family moved to Lexington, where his mother found work as a seamstress. He graduated high school in 1931, into the full depth of the Depression, and enlisted in the Army at 19 because there was nothing else available that paid. He went to the Philippines initially in 1934, part of the regular rotation of American Army soldiers stationed there, but then found that he was suited to jungle work in a way that surprised his instructors. He extended his tour. He extended it again. By 1941, he had been in the Philippines for 7 years, with intervals back to the mainland for training. He knew the terrain. He knew the flora. He had spent enough time moving through dense growth that his body had adjusted to it in subtle ways. Pace, breathing, the angle of feet placement on uncertain ground, that soldiers new to jungle operations would have to learn over months or years. He was present for the disaster of December 1941. When the Japanese invaded in force following Pearl Harbor, the American and Filipino forces on Luzon conducted a fighting retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. Harmon's unit was in the retreat's early stages, at a particularly vicious period of action where American forces fought sharp rearguard actions against a better equipped, better supplied, numerically superior enemy that had command of the air. He fought at Layak Junction in January 1942, a series of engagements where small American units attempted to delay Japanese advances long enough for main forces to consolidate the Bataan defensive lines. He was among the soldiers who escaped Bataan before the surrender on April 9th. How he escaped is another story that warrants its own examination. The abbreviated version: he walked into the jungle 3 days before the surrender, oriented by compass south and then west, spent 19 days moving through occupied Philippine territory, and eventually reached a small coastal settlement where a fishing boat carried him to Mindanao. From Mindanao, a submarine extracted him and a handful of other evaders in June 1942. He went back to the United States. He was promoted to sergeant, then staff sergeant, then technical sergeant. He received additional training. He requested redeployment to the Pacific. His request was noted, filed, and granted in 1944, in time for MacArthur's return to the Philippines and the opening of the Leyte campaign. He had been waiting for it. The immediate aftermath of December 14th produced no formal recognition. The Army was busy. Leyte was still actively contested, and individual soldiers' actions, however extreme, were processed through a bureaucratic machinery that had more inputs than it could manage. And a recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross was filed by Major Pressler in late December, and made its way through channels with the pace characteristic of wartime administration. It reached the appropriate reviewing authority in February 1945 and was approved. Harmon was not present for the ceremony. He was back in the field. The DSC citation described him, in the language of formal military commendation, as having displayed extraordinary heroism and dedication to duty under conditions of extreme adversity. It specified the destruction of the communications equipment and the recovery of intelligence materials. It made no mention of 59 dead soldiers and the means of their deaths. Citations rarely do. Yet he received the medal from a colonel he had never met at a brief ceremony outside a command tent near Manila in March 1945. The colonel shook his hand and said something about courage. Harmon nodded. The ceremony took 11 minutes. He was in the field again by afternoon. The war in the Pacific ended on September 2, 1945, when Japanese officials signed the Instrument of Surrender aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Ray Harmon was on Luzon when it happened, in the process of clearing a mountainous region where isolated Japanese units refused to accept or had not received word of the surrender. He spent 3 more weeks on that work before rotating back to a depot near Manila. He left the Philippines in November 1945 and returned to the United States aboard a transport ship. He was 32 years old. As a technical sergeant with 12 years of service, a Distinguished Service Cross, and a left ear that was simply absent, a fact he accommodated by wearing his garrison cap pulled low on that side and otherwise declining to acknowledge. He was processed out of the Army in January 1946. He received his separation pay, a train ticket to Lexington, Kentucky, and a set of civilian clothes. He put on the clothes and went home. Back in Kentucky, he found work as a land surveyor, a trade that suited his ability to read terrain and move through it with precision. He married in 1948, a woman named Catherine Morse, who taught 3rd grade at a school in Fayette County. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter. He built a house. He surveyed land. He did not speak about the Philippines in any detailed way. Not because he was traumatized in any theatrical sense. Those who knew him in later life describe a man who was quiet but not troubled, who enjoyed fishing, who was patient with his children and precise in his work. He simply did not discuss it. When veterans groups asked him to speak, he declined. When a journalist working on a history of the Leyte campaign contacted him in 1968, he agreed to answer written questions but specified that he would not provide accounts of specific actions in the field. He answered questions about logistics, terrain, unit structure, and the general experience of Philippine jungle warfare. He answered nothing about December 14, 1944. His after-action account, written in January 1945 and classified shortly after, remained classified until 1979. By then, Harmon was 66 years old and retired from surveying. A historian working on a project about Army reconnaissance operations filed a Freedom of Information request that produced the partial declassification. The historian, a researcher at the University of Kentucky named Thomas Garrard, drove to Harmon's home in Fayette County to discuss it. Harmon read the account over coffee, confirmed its accuracy with a single nod, and said that the historian could quote from it if he wished. He answered 2 questions about specifics: the weight of the Arisaka and whether the supply depot had been guarded by dogs, which it had not, and then said that he thought the document spoke for itself and he had nothing to add. Garrard's book, published in 1981, devoted 14 pages to the December 14th action. That it remains the most detailed secondary account available. Ray Harmon died in 1994 at the age of 81 of heart failure at his home in Lexington, Kentucky. He was buried at Camp Nelson National Cemetery with military honors. His Distinguished Service Cross and a photograph of him in uniform in 1944 are in the possession of his daughter, who still lives in Fayette County. The legacy of what Harmon did that night is not found in any memorial or named doctrine. It is found in the quietly practical ways that his after-action account influenced reconnaissance training in the decades that followed. The account was incorporated into Army Ranger training curricula in the early 1980s, after declassification made it available for educational use as a case study in improvised compound clearance and prisoner of war self-extraction. Ranger instructors used it to teach a specific principle: that the moment of capture is not the end of a mission. It is the beginning of a different one. The account also features in survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training, SERE, in military shorthand, as an example of the psychological principle that the account itself never articulates but demonstrates throughout, that a person retains agency in every situation until the situation physically prevents agency from being exercised. The physical removal of an ear does not prevent agency. Harmon demonstrated this empirically in 44 minutes at 03:38 hours on December 14, 1944. Military historians who examine the action in the context of the broader Leyte campaign point to the maps he recovered as the most durable material impact. At the supply route, intelligence accelerated American control of the northwestern highlands by an estimated 10 to 14 days, according to post-war operational analyses. In a campaign measured in months and measured in lives, 10 days is not a small number. But metrics miss something essential about what happened in that compound. 59 trained soldiers, armed and organized, died because one man with a piece of wire and a borrowed rifle refused to accept the verdict that had been handed to him. He did not refuse it emotionally or dramatically. He refused it the way a surveyor refuses to accept a measurement that doesn't add up. He checked the numbers. He found the error. He corrected it. The hills above Ormoc Bay looked the same the morning after as they had the morning before. The jungle grew where it had always grown, and the war moved on, as wars do, toward its own eventual conclusion. And Ray Harmon walked 8 miles through the dark and asked for breakfast. The story in the end is that simple, and that extraordinary. Immediate aftermath. Within 4 days of Harmon's return, the maps he recovered led to the destruction of 2 Japanese supply depots and the identification of a third. Major Pressler filed his DSC recommendation on December 28th. The garrison's compound was discovered by a Japanese patrol on December 20th, 6 days after the action. No reinforcement reached the area in time to affect ongoing American operations. Protagonist's fate. Ray Harmon served through the end of the Philippine campaign and the closing months of the Pacific War without significant additional incident documented in available records. He separated from the Army in January 1946, returned to Kentucky, worked as a land surveyor for 30 years, married, raised 2 children, and died of heart failure in 1994. He received the Distinguished Service Cross in March 1945. He did not speak publicly about December 14, 1944, and declined all requests to do so for the remainder of his life. Historical legacy. His after-action account, partially declassified in 1979, became a teaching document in Army Ranger and SERI training programs through the 1980s and 1990s. The compound clearance sequence is cited in military training literature as an example of effective improvised tactics under extreme constraint. The intelligence recovered from the garrison materially accelerated the American consolidation of Leyte. Historian Thomas Garrard's 1981 account remains the definitive secondary source. The case continues to be discussed in military professional education programs as an example of mission continuity under capture conditions. Final reflection. He asked for breakfast twice. The second time, someone found something. He sat outside the aid station in the December heat of Leyte Island and ate whatever it was without apparent ceremony. A man who had been captured, tortured, and left for dead the day before, eating breakfast in the sun. The math had worked out. He moved on. Call to action. If this story stayed with you the way it stays with us, hit that like button. Subscribe for more forgotten stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when the world demanded it. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these memories alive.